He abandoned his wife fighting cancer for his mistress, but Inheritance Day brought an unexpected twist. The rain battered the streets of Washington, turning the sidewalks into mirrors of water that reflected the light from the street lamps. The wind blew relentlessly, stripping leaves from the trees and making the windows shake. Inside a house with imposing architecture, Grace Morgan looked out of the living room window. The 35-year-old woman looked much older than her age would suggest. The disease that consumed her body every day robbed her of vitality but not of determination. She clutched a blanket against her thin shoulders as her mind wandered, trapped in a spiral of memories. On the corner table next to her rested an almost untouched glass of tea, its smoke already disappearing into the cold air. Grace didn't have the strength to drink it, but it wasn't physical weakness that held her there. It was the emptiness. A devastating silence had filled the house since Daniel, her husband, had practically abandoned her. Daniel was a charismatic man, with an engaging speech and impeccable appearance. When they first met, Grace believed he was her safe haven, a man who would protect her from all of life's misfortunes. But little by little, he had become a stranger in her own home. The work excuses, the nights out, and the averted glances had become an unbearable routine. Now he didn't even bother to disguise it. He spent more time out than in, and Grace knew exactly with whom. On the other side of town, Daniel was in the apartment with Claire. Young, attractive, and ambitious, she was everything Daniel thought he needed to escape the weight of a marriage he found suffocating. Claire enveloped him with her easy laughter and calculated charm, while silently analyzing the advantages of keeping a man like him by her side. Before continuing this story, leave your like and comment on which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has gone. Are you going to leave her for good, or are we going to carry on like this until something happens? Asked Claire, reclining on the sofa while holding a glass of wine. It's not that simple, Claire, Daniel replied, massaging his temples. Grace is ill. You know that. I can't just turn my back on her. Claire narrowed her eyes, watching him with an expression of false understanding. Sick or not, you've already left her. Her heart is no longer there, Daniel, and I swear I keep going there because I want to be close to you. He knew she was right, but admitting it out loud felt like condemnation, so he remained silent, drinking the rest of his whiskey while trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. That same evening, Grace heard the sound of the front door opening. The sound of keys on the hall table echoed through the house, a cruel reminder that despite everything, Daniel still made a point of coming back. Perhaps it was out of obligation, perhaps out of guilt, but never out of love. You're late, she said without turning around as she sat in the armchair next to the fireplace. I wasn't in the mood to argue, he replied, walking towards the stairs. Grace just smiled bitterly to herself. The absence of any effort in her reply hurt more than any argument could. The next morning, the sun tried to penetrate the heavy grey clouds that covered the city. Grace woke up to the dim light coming through her bedroom window. Her eyes were drawn to the bedside table, where a picture frame displayed a photo from their wedding. She and Daniel were smiling, radiant, as if nothing could break the promise of happiness they had made that day. Grace picked up the picture frame, running her trembling fingers over the cold surface of the glass. A solitary tear fell, but she quickly wiped it away. There was no time for tears. Time, in fact, was what she had the least of. Later that day, Grace received a visit from her best friend, Eleanor. Unlike Daniel, Eleanor was always by her side, offering unconditional support even in the darkest moments. You look more down than usual today, said Eleanor, placing a bouquet of flowers on the kitchen table. I'm just tired. Eleanor didn't believe her answer, but she knew there was no point in insisting. Grace was stubborn and rarely shared the depth of her pain. While they were talking, Daniel sent a message to Claire. Tonight, I'll meet you in the same place. I need to see you every night, otherwise I won't be able to stand the pressure. Hours later, Grace was in the living room alone again, her eyes fixed on an antique mirror hanging on the wall. It was an object she rarely noticed, but that night it seemed to call to her. The mirror had belonged to her mother, an heirloom that Grace kept more out of obligation than appreciation. She approached it looking at her reflection. The face she saw looked strange. There were deep expression lines, dark circles that told of sleepless nights, and a pallor that spoke louder than any medical diagnosis. Grace reached out, touching the cold glass, as if looking for something beyond the reflection. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the house. Grace stepped back with the strange sensation that the mirror had returned her gaze in an unnatural way. She shook her head, attributing it to exhaustion. Daniel returned late once again, but something was different about his expression. He avoided looking at Grace, going straight up to the bedroom. Grace, however, noticed. It was as if a thread of guilt had reached him, even for a moment. Over the next few days, small events began to occur in the house. Daniel would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that he was being watched. One day, he found the mirror in the living room covered with a black cloth, something Grace never did. He tried to ask, but she simply answered, "Some things must be protected from what we don't want to see." The enigmatic words bothered him, but he preferred to ignore them. As Daniel moved further and further away, Grace spent more time watching the mirror, as if waiting for it to show her something. Eleanor often visited her, trying to distract her, but there was a change in Grace that she couldn't fully understand. "What are you planning?" Eleanor asked one silent afternoon. Grace didn't answer immediately. She just smiled almost imperceptibly before saying, "Don't worry now. When the time comes, I'll need your help, my friend. I can only count on you." The tone in her voice indicated that something was coming, something that no one could have predicted. For many years, Daniel Morgan had been the perfect son-in-law, not just because of his natural charm, but because of the way he had integrated himself into Grace's family business. When her parents died tragically in a car accident, Grace inherited the company they had built up over decades, a renowned architecture firm that stood out for innovation and sustainability. Despite having no aptitude for the corporate world, Grace trusted Daniel to take over. He, with his unbridled ambition, seized the opportunity, maintaining the company as a national powerhouse. In everyone's eyes, Daniel was a visionary. But Grace knew the truth. While he pursued profit, she alone carried the emotional weight of losing her parents. And even when she found out she was seriously ill, Daniel seemed more interested in preserving his public image than being by her side. The diagnosis came on a spring day that should have been sunny, but seemed covered by a shadow. Grace had started noticing the symptoms months before: extreme fatigue, persistent bone pain, bruises that appeared without explanation. After a battery of tests, the confirmation was devastating: acute myeloid leukemia, an aggressive form of blood cancer. She prepared herself to fight, not only for her life, but also to keep intact the dignity that her parents had always taught her to preserve. While Grace faced endless chemotherapy sessions, Daniel seemed increasingly absent. It was during one of these sessions that Claire came into their lives. She was the physiotherapist that Grace had hired on the recommendation of the hospital to help her regain her physical strength, weakened by the treatments. Claire was young, vibrant, and caring, at least on the surface. Grace, in her infinite kindness, never suspected the hidden intentions of the woman who now frequented her home on a daily basis. At first, Claire seemed dedicated to her work. She made Grace walk slowly around the garden, encouraged light exercise, and offered words of motivation. But it was Daniel who really caught her attention. He used to drop by the exercise room to superficially ask how the sessions were going, but Claire noticed how out of place he seemed. She was adept at exploiting Daniel's weaknesses, subtle comments here and there, an accidental touch on his arm as they passed each other. It wasn't long before the two of them were engaged in longer conversations, first about Grace, then about other subjects. Claire knew exactly how to present herself as the opposite of Grace: relaxed, full of life, and seemingly free of problems. Daniel, for his part, was tired. He found himself trapped in a marriage with a sick woman, feeling that the weight of his responsibility was increasing every day. Claire was like an escape for him, a breath of fresh air amidst the suffocation of his reality. Their relationship began on the quiet, brief encounters, furtive glances, but over time, the attraction became undeniable. Daniel started making excuses to spend more time away from home, while Claire started planting seeds of doubt. Grace is strong, but Claire let the phrase hang in the air one afternoon, while she was with Daniel in the house's private gym. "But what?" Daniel asked, frowning. "I'm just saying, sometimes it's important to think about the future." She gave a sympathetic smile, but her eyes sparkled with mischief. The future became the recurring theme of Claire's conversations. She encouraged Daniel to imagine a life without Grace, a life where he wouldn't have to deal with hospitals, doctors, or the burden of a terminal illness. and Daniel, vulnerable and blinded by attraction, began to give in. "When all this is over," Claire whispered one night as they sat together in her apartment, "imagine the possibilities. You and me, a house in California, trips around Europe, new cars, freedom." Daniel didn't answer immediately, but the smile on his lips said everything Claire needed to hear. Meanwhile, Grace continued to struggle alone. She could see the growing distance between her and Daniel, but chose not to confront him directly. Perhaps it was fear of the truth, or perhaps it was the desire not to waste her strength on arguments that wouldn't change anything. Eleanor, her best friend, began to notice Claire's behavior. "I don't trust her," Eleanor said one afternoon, while helping Grace organize documents in her office. "Claire has been a relief in these difficult times," Grace replied, trying to hide the doubt that was beginning to creep into her heart. "You're too generous, Grace. Just be careful." But Grace didn't want to believe that the woman who helped her every day could be involved in something so cruel. Not until she began to notice small details. The long looks between Daniel and Claire, the conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. It was on a particularly silent night that Grace realized what was happening. She didn't know the details, but she was sure that Daniel was involved with Claire. At that moment, her physical pain was overtaken by the emotional pain of realizing that the man she loved was cheating on her so blatantly. But instead of confronting him, Grace kept her pain to herself. She began to observe more closely, listen in on hidden conversations, and ask discreet questions. Each new piece of evidence was like a knife in her heart, but she stood firm. There was something growing inside her, a strength that not even illness could erase. As Grace began to draw up plans that she herself still didn't fully understand, Daniel and Claire became more and more reckless. "Have you thought about what you're going to do with her money?" Claire asked one evening, while the two of them were together in the luxury apartment he was renting to meet Claire. "What? Don't pretend you haven't thought about it, Daniel. Her company, the mansion, the money, it's all going to be yours. It's only a matter of time." Daniel hesitated. "She's ill, Claire. It's not right." "It's not right?" Claire laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "You've already crossed the line, Daniel. Don't pretend it's out of compassion that you're still there." Daniel knew Claire was right, but the guilt that consumed him made him resist admitting it. He began to avoid Grace even more, fearing that she might notice his hesitation. But Grace didn't just notice. She understood more than he realized. And while Daniel and Claire continued to plan a future together, Grace began to put together the pieces of something much bigger. Grace woke up to another gray morning, her body feeling heavy, as if her own flesh carried the weight of years of suffering. Her eyes stared at the ceiling for a long time before she mustered the strength to get up. Every day the fatigue seemed more unbearable. It wasn't just the leukemia that robbed her of energy, but the pretense around her. She felt as if everyone around her was playing a role, especially Claire. That morning, Grace decided that she would no longer continue her physiotherapy sessions. Claire, with her joviality and smiles that had once seemed so genuine, was now a presence that suffocated her. Every caring touch, every word of encouragement sounded false. It wasn't just an intuition. Grace knew deep down that Claire wasn't there to help her, but to get closer to Daniel. "I won't be needing any more of your sessions, Claire," Grace said firmly, as she sat down in the armchair in the living room. Claire stopped in the middle of the room, her perfect face frozen in an expression of controlled surprise. "What do you mean?" asked Claire with a tone of false concern. "I mean that I'm dispensing with your services." "Grace, you know you need to keep your strength." Grace interrupted with a wave of her hand. "I'm dispensing with the lessons, Claire. I'd rather do without them." Claire tried to argue but realized it would be useless. Grace wouldn't change her mind. She left the house with a cold smile on her lips, but inside she was furious. How dare Grace cut her out of her life when she was already so close to achieving what she wanted? Arriving at the luxury apartment Daniel was secretly renting, Claire was clearly upset, but she knew exactly how to turn her frustration into a weapon. "You wouldn't believe what Grace did today," said Claire, throwing her bag on the sofa and pretending to be exhausted. Daniel looked at her confused. "What happened?" "She dismissed me. She said she didn't need my help anymore." Daniel frowned. "That doesn't make sense. You're helping her get better." Claire moved closer, sitting down next to him and touching his arm almost imperceptibly. "Maybe she's frustrated. Maybe she's transferring her anger to the people around her." She paused, studying Daniel's reactions before continuing. "But I don't blame her. It must be horrible for her to see you so busy, always working to keep everything running smoothly with me." Daniel sighed deeply, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I'm doing the best I can, Claire." "I know," Claire said softly, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "That's why I'm here, to look after you." And that's how Claire played the game. Every time Grace made a move that threatened her position, she reinforced the idea that Daniel was a victim of circumstance, someone who needed care and attention, and Claire was the only person who seemed to offer him that. Daniel, who became more and more involved, began to drift further away from Grace. He rarely showed up at the company, even though he kept insisting that he was busy keeping everything running. In fact, most of his time was spent with Claire in luxurious hotels and expensive restaurants, in their apartment, financed with the money Grace had inherited from her parents. "You should hire more help for Grace," Claire suggested one evening, while the two of them were having dinner at an exclusive restaurant in downtown Washington. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, cutting into a piece of steak that looked like it had been served straight from heaven. "Hire nurses, caregivers, anything she needs, especially now that she's fired me. Does she think you'll spend more time there with her? Hiring other professionals will give you more time to breathe and spend more time with me after all. I'm very lonely." Daniel nodded slowly as if the idea was entirely his own. It makes sense. Deep down, he knew that this was just another way of distancing himself from his wife, but he no longer felt guilty. Claire had a special ability to convince him that all his decisions were justifiable. Meanwhile, Grace watched Daniel's behavior with attentive eyes. He hardly saw her anymore, but when he did, there was a coldness in his gaze that made her shudder. He was no longer the man she had married, the man who had sworn to protect her. Now he was a stranger, distant, angry, almost indifferent. "You should hire someone to help you more, Grace," said Daniel on one of his rare visits to the living room, "especially now that you no longer have a physiotherapist." He was standing with his phone in one hand, typing something quickly. "I'm very busy keeping the company afloat." Grace looked up at him, her eyes shining with something between sadness and incredulity. "The company on its feet," she repeated, her voice calm but loaded with meaning. "You haven't even been in the office for weeks." Daniel froze for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he said, looking away. "I have to visit so many clients, and that's why I hardly show up at the office. You really don't understand." "No, Daniel, I don't think I really understand." He didn't reply. He just left the room, turning his attention to his cell phone, which never seemed to stop ringing. Claire, on the other hand, was everything Daniel thought he needed right now. Young, attractive, and full of energy, she knew exactly how to keep control over him. She laughed at his jokes, made him feel admired, and even teased him with discreet flirtations that made him jealous. One night, at an exclusive bar where they were with some of her friends, Claire danced with an unknown man. Daniel, watching from across the room, felt his blood boil. When she turned to him with a carefree smile, he couldn't hide his irritation. "What were you doing?" he asked, taking a firm hold of her arm. "Just having fun," Claire replied, as if she hadn't done anything wrong. "You know I don't like that." Claire let out a light laugh, sliding her fingers down his arm. "Are you jealous?" Daniel didn't answer, but she knew she had won. That was the kind of game Claire played so well. She made him feel like he was the only man in the world for her, while at the same time creating the insecurity that kept him tied to her. As the months passed, Daniel became completely dependent on Claire. He believed that she was the only good thing in his life, the only person who really understood him. He barely spoke to Grace, and when he did, it was only to suggest that he hire more help or to ask superficial questions about his health. Grace saw all this, felt every insult, every neglect like a knife in her heart. But she was no longer the woman who suffered in silence. Something inside her was changing. She was learning to transform her pain into something much more powerful. Grace looked into the full-length mirror in her bedroom. The reflection she saw was not that of a defeated woman, but of someone consumed by a silent pain that, day after day, was turning into determination. The last few months had been a cruel test of endurance. Daniel's betrayal, her illness, and the gradual distancing from everything familiar formed a storm that would have broken many people. But Grace couldn't allow herself to give in. She had to act. and she knew she couldn't do it alone. Picking up the phone next to her bed, she dialed Eleanor, her best friend and confidant. "Eleanor, I need you. It's urgent." On the other end of the line, Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Grace hung up and started organizing the papers she kept in her office. There were old bank statements, company records, contracts, and documents relating to her parents' will. She knew she needed concrete information before making any decisions. Daniel was charismatic and manipulative, but Grace had something he underestimated, an intelligence he never appreciated. Eleanor arrived shortly afterwards, worried by the tone of Grace's call. "What's going on, Grace?" she asked, hurrying into the living room. Grace looked at her friend with dark eyes. "I want to set up a meeting with the company's lawyer. I need to understand what's going on with the business. Daniel hasn't set foot in the company for months, and I want to know what he's up to." Eleanor frowned, worried. "Do you think he—" "I'm sure." Grace took a deep breath, holding her friend's arm. "But I need proof before I can take any action." With Eleanor's help, Grace contacted the company's lawyer, the respectable Robert Simmons, who had worked for her family for decades. Robert didn't hesitate to make an appointment for a confidential meeting, especially when Grace mentioned that she needed to discuss something sensitive. The next day, Grace and Eleanor arrived at Robert's office, an elegant and discreet space in downtown Washington. Grace was visibly paler than usual, and the effort of leaving the house seemed to have exhausted her, but her eyes were firm and determined. "Grace, it's a pleasure to see you," said Robert, shaking her hand gently. "I'm sorry the circumstances aren't the best." "Thank you, Robert. We need to talk, and I need everything we say here to stay between us." Robert nodded, closing the office door and motioning for them to sit down. "Of course. How can I help you?" Grace began to explain her concerns. "Daniel has been distancing himself more and more from the company. He tells me he's busy, that he's working to keep the business profitable, but something isn't right. I want to see the financial records for the last few months. I want to know exactly what's going on." Robert looked at Grace for a moment, as if pondering the implications of what she was asking, but finally opened his briefcase and accessed the documents on his laptop. "As you're the majority owner of the company, I have full access to the records. I'll show you everything." The lawyer began to open graphs, spreadsheets, and detailed statements. As he explained the figures, Grace felt a mixture of anger and sadness rise up inside her. "Here are the payments made on behalf of the company over the last 6 months. Robert adjusted his glasses and pointed to a list of transactions. Grace stared at the screen, scrutinizing each line. There were the regular withdrawals Daniel made, claiming they were to cover her medical costs and treatments, but there were other expenses that caught her eye. "Rent for a luxury apartment," Grace muttered, almost to herself. Robert confirmed it. "Yes, a luxury apartment in the center. Daniel explained that it was necessary for you to have a comfortable place near the hospital, but—" Grace interrupted, feeling her throat tighten. "I've never left home to stay anywhere else." She continued reading. Expensive restaurants, luxury stores, jewelry. Each transaction was like a direct blow to the chest. All of this was paid for with the company's money, the money her parents had worked their whole lives to build up. Money that should have been used to help support her fight against the disease. Eleanor, who was standing next to her, was watching everything with growing concern. "Grace, are you all right?" she asked, seeing her friend's face turn even paler. Grace tried to answer but felt a wave of dizziness. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, as if the air was being sucked out of her lungs. "Grace!" Eleanor shouted, catching her before she fell off the chair. Robert quickly grabbed a glass of water and called for an ambulance, but Grace raised her hand with an effort. "No, I don't need an ambulance. I'm fine." "You're not fine," Eleanor insisted, holding Grace's hands. "Just give me a moment," Grace whispered, trying to catch her breath. She closed her eyes, trying to calm the heart that seemed to want to burst out of her chest. After a few minutes, her breathing began to stabilize. Eleanor watched her with watery eyes, while Robert stood to the side, clearly worried. "You can't wear yourself out like this, Grace," Eleanor said softly, still holding her hand. Grace opened her eyes, now filled with tears that she refused to let fall. "He stole my life, Eleanor, and now he's stealing my family's legacy." Eleanor didn't know what to say. All she could do was hug her friend, trying to offer some comfort. After Grace had pulled herself together, Robert continued to present the information. "Grace, I can take legal action immediately if you like. but that will require even more solid evidence. If you want, we can start monitoring every transaction he makes from now on." Grace looked at him, her eyes now full of determination. "Yes, Robert, do it. I want to know exactly where every penny is going." When they left the office, Eleanor helped Grace into the car. "Are you sure you want to carry on with this?" Eleanor asked. Grace turned her face to look at her friend. "I'm sure. He's going to pay for everything." Deep down, Eleanor knew that Grace was right, but she also feared that this effort would consume her completely. As the car drove off, Grace looked out of the window at the grey Washington skyline. She knew she was fighting a battle on two fronts, against her illness and against the man who had sworn to be by her side forever, and she didn't know which one would be harder to win. Claire was a born strategist. She knew exactly how to manipulate Daniel so that he remained completely under her control. Her seduction game was a precise dance of advances and retreats, always leaving Daniel hungry for more. She whispered promises in his ear, but never gave everything away. There was always a hint, a mystery, something that kept Daniel in a constant state of anxiety and desire. "You know you could have any man, Claire," Daniel remarked one evening as they sat together in an expensive restaurant in New York, a dinner he had justified to Grace as a business meeting. Claire smiled, sliding her fingers down her wineglass. "Maybe, but I chose you," she replied, with a sparkle in her eyes that made Daniel's heart race. However, there was always something in her words that made him insecure, a slight suggestion that she could change her mind at any moment. That was what made her irresistible to him. He didn't just desire Claire. He feared her, feared losing her to another man, feared not being enough. Claire used this to her advantage, playing on Daniel's jealousy to bend him even more to her will. She danced with other men at parties, answered messages on her cell phone with an enigmatic smile, and sometimes cancelled dates with him at the last minute, saying she had other priorities. All this made Daniel sink even deeper into his obsession. "You're not going to leave me, are you?" he asked once, his voice laden with insecurity. "Why would I?" Claire replied softly, before smiling and walking away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Daniel was so involved that he began to do things he had never imagined. He no longer had any qualms about embezzling money from Grace's company. He justified it to himself as a way of investing in his future with Claire. Trips, lavish dinners, expensive clothes. Nothing was enough to please her. When Claire casually mentioned that she would love to visit Europe, Daniel didn't think twice before planning a week-long trip to Paris. "Grace won't get suspicious?" Claire asked, feigning concern, although she was clearly pleased. "I'll tell her it's a work conference. She's used to my trips." And so Daniel and Claire embarked for France, leaving Grace alone in Washington. Throughout the trip, Claire kept Daniel exactly where she wanted him, charmed and insecure at the same time, always trying to prove that he deserved to be by her side. Meanwhile, Grace was aware of Daniel's every move. With the help of Eleanor and lawyer Robert Simmons, she continued to monitor his spending. Credit card transactions, cash withdrawals, hotel bookings, everything was recorded. "They're in Paris now," Robert informed her during a meeting in his office. Eleanor clenched her fists, struggling to contain her anger. He has no shame. He leaves his sick wife to wander around Europe with that woman. Grace, who was sitting quietly, just closed her eyes for a moment. The pain in her chest was almost unbearable, but she didn't let any tears fall. "It doesn't matter where he is now," she said, her voice weak but determined. "This just proves that we're on the right track." Even so, the whole situation was taking its toll on Grace. Her body, already weakened by leukemia, began to show signs of worsening. She felt constantly dizzy. Her immunity was so low that any little cold seemed like a mortal danger, and the exhaustion was almost unbearable. One afternoon, while reviewing the latest financial reports with Eleanor in her living room, Grace began to feel very dizzy. "Grace, are you all right?" Eleanor asked, concerned, as she saw her friend's face turn even paler. "I just need a moment," Grace replied. But before she could complete her sentence, her vision blurred and she almost fell off her chair. Eleanor held Grace in time, but the panic was evident in her voice. "Grace, you need to go to the hospital. Now." Grace tried to protest, but she didn't have the strength to argue. Eleanor quickly called an ambulance and Grace was rushed to hospital. There, the doctors confirmed what Eleanor had already feared. Grace's condition had deteriorated. Her immunity was dangerously low and she needed immediate care. As she lay in the hospital bed, Grace looked at Eleanor, her expression laden with sadness. "He doesn't know I'm here, Eleanor, and even if he did, I don't think he'd care." Eleanor held her friend's hand tightly. "You don't need him, Grace, you have me. And let's get this out in the open." While Grace struggled to recover, Daniel and Claire were busy living out their fantasies in Paris. He never called home, never asked how Grace was. For him, Grace was a responsibility he had abandoned, and Claire was his new life. But what Daniel didn't know was that his every move was being documented. Grace, Eleanor, and Robert were working in secret, gathering all the evidence they needed to expose his betrayals and manipulations. "When this is all over, he won't know what hit him," Grace told Eleanor, her voice weak but full of determination. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to fall deeper and deeper into Claire's game. She was everything he wanted, and everything he feared losing. He was so blinded by desire that he didn't realize he was heading for his own destruction. Grace fell ill and had to be rushed to hospital. The hospital room was completely silent, broken only by the monotonous sound of medical equipment. Grace lay motionless, her breathing weak and irregular. The doctors had done everything they could, but her body was exhausted, unable to fight the disease that had been eating away at every fiber of her existence for months. Eleanor held her friend's hand, her eyes watering as she whispered words of comfort, even though she knew that Grace was already far away, between the world of the living and eternal silence. "You were so strong, Grace, so strong," Eleanor murmured as a tear ran down her cheek. A short while later, the heart monitor emitted a sharp, continuous sound. Grace's heart had stopped. Eleanor shouted for the doctors, but knew there was nothing more to be done. Grace Morgan was gone, alone, while the man she had sworn to love was thousands of kilometers away, living a life she had never imagined. At the Eiffel Tower, the atmosphere was one of romance and ostentation. Daniel and Claire were in a luxurious restaurant at the top of the iconic structure, toasting expensive champagne and laughing carefree. Claire was stunning in an eye-catching red dress, and Daniel, as always, seemed fascinated by her. "This place is perfect," said Claire, holding her glass elegantly. "You really know how to treat a woman." Daniel smiled proudly, but before he could reply, his phone vibrated on the table. He frowned when he saw Eleanor's name on the screen. "Who's that?" asked Claire with a slightly jealous tone. "Eleanor," Daniel replied, before sighing and answering the call. On the other end of the line, Eleanor didn't wait for him to say anything. Her voice was harsh, full of indignation and pain. "Grace is dead, Daniel. She's gone." The words fell like a direct blow to Daniel's chest. He froze, his face losing color as the information slowly penetrated his mind. "What?" was all he managed to say, his voice almost a whisper. "You heard right. Grace died alone in hospital while you were there, who knows where, doing who knows what." Eleanor hung up before he could answer, leaving him staring at the phone in shock. "What's wrong?" Claire asked, leaning over the table. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Grace, she's passed away." Claire blinked in surprise, but deep down she felt a flash of satisfaction. She quickly composed an expression of sadness and reached out to touch Daniel's hand. "Oh, Daniel, I'm so sorry." He pulled his hand away, visibly shaken, and began searching for flights back to Washington on his cell phone. "I have to go. The funeral. I need to be there." Claire nodded, but internally she was already imagining the life she would have next to him now. The mansion, the money, the freedom to live without having to hide. Everything was finally within reach. The journey back was silent. Daniel barely looked at Claire, lost in thought as guilt began to creep into his heart. He thought about the months he had neglected Grace, the lies, the days when he didn't answer her calls because he was with Claire. For a moment he felt a twinge of regret, but Claire, ever astute, spotted it immediately. "You can't blame yourself, Daniel," she said softly as she slid her hand down his arm. "You did everything you could. Grace knew you were busy. She knew you were keeping everything going." Daniel wanted to believe her, wanted to get rid of that weight that was growing on his chest. Claire moved closer, leaning her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "Now you have to be strong. For her." It was enough to make him cling to that excuse. He didn't reply but let Claire stay by his side, easing the weight of his guilt with her seductive presence. The black car glided smoothly through the cemetery while the Washington sky was grey and heavy. Daniel and Claire arrived just in time for the funeral, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. He wore an impeccable suit, but his expression was downcast, carrying a mixture of guilt and shame. Next to him, Claire wore a tight black dress with a discreet veil that barely disguised her beauty. As they walked towards the burial site, Daniel felt the stares of the people around them. Everyone knew. Every relative, every friend, every former employee of the company knew what he had done. Eleanor, who was standing next to the coffin, gave him a look that was pure contempt. "Eleanor," Daniel began, but she held up her hand, cutting him off. "Don't speak to me, Daniel. You don't deserve to be here." Daniel swallowed, feeling small in the face of Eleanor's silent fury. Claire, on the other hand, stood her ground, holding Daniel's arm as if she were walking down a red carpet. As Grace's coffin was slowly lowered into the earth, Daniel felt a wave of conflicting emotions. He wanted to feel sad. He wanted to believe that he was mourning the loss of his wife, but the truth was that the weight of guilt made everything even more unbearable. He looked at Claire, who maintained a perfectly controlled expression, and tried to convince himself that he was doing the right thing. But the looks around him left no doubt. Everyone knew who he was. And for the first time, Daniel began to realize that perhaps he was drowning in the life he had chosen. After the funeral, Daniel and Claire arrived at Grace's mansion that evening, the silence of the house seeming heavier than ever. It was as if the walls had absorbed Grace's absence and were now witnessing the arrival of Claire, the woman who had unceremoniously taken her place. Daniel sat on the sofa in the living room, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands covering his face. He was emotionally exhausted, the weight of the funeral still pressing down on his chest. "You need to relax," Claire said softly, kneeling down in front of him. She took hold of his hands, pulling them away from his face. "There's no point in torturing yourself." Daniel looked at her with red eyes, guilt overflowing. "I abandoned her, Claire. Grace was alone. I don't even know how she's been over the last few months." Claire, always cunning, saw the opportunity to manipulate his feelings. She held his face with both hands and looked directly into his eyes. "You did everything you could, Daniel. Grace knew you loved her. She understood. And anyway, you couldn't prevent what happened. But I lied to her," he muttered, looking away. Claire didn't hesitate. With a soft, reassuring smile, she climbed into Daniel's lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You spared her from suffering, Daniel. She was ill, suffering. Now she's at peace, and you need to accept that." She tilted her head, whispering close to his ear, "And I'm here for you. I always have been." Claire knew exactly how to calm Daniel down, how to take him away from his turbulent thoughts. That night, she took him to bed and made sure he felt wanted, loved, and above all distracted. Her actions were not out of genuine affection, but out of calculation. The more Daniel was attached to her, the easier it would be to mold him to her goals. Later, as Daniel lay in bed still lost in thought, Claire returned with a glass of whiskey for him. She sat down next to him, offering him the glass with a warm smile. "Here, it will help you relax." Daniel obeyed, sipping slowly as Claire spoke. "Grace knew the end was near. You did what you could to look after her, perhaps not as a husband, but as someone who knew she needed space. She left in peace, and now you need to find yours." She leaned closer, speaking in a comforting tone. "Time will heal this, Daniel, and I'm here to help you. We can start to put the past behind us, focus on us, on our life together." Daniel shook his head, still unsure, but Claire knew he was surrendering. "You know what I think would be good for you?" she suggested with a charming smile. "A trip away from it all. A place where you can breathe, relax, forget for a while." "A trip?" he asked, hesitantly. "Yes, let's go to California. The sun, the sea, a little distraction." "You need that, Daniel." He didn't answer straight away, but after a few moments he agreed with a nod. Claire knew she had won. California was a dream for Claire. While Daniel still carried a shadow of guilt, she was at the height of her happiness. Every day was a new opportunity to strengthen her hold on him. Claire took him to bars and lavish parties, where she was the center of attention. Men looked at her with admiration, and she made a point of encouraging their gazes, knowing that this fueled Daniel's jealousy. "Did you see the way that man looked at you?" Daniel commented one night while they were in a bar on the beach. Claire laughed, sliding her hand down his arm. "You know I only have eyes for you, don't you?" But the teasing glint in her eyes said something else. Daniel, increasingly consumed by his obsession with her, strove to keep her by his side, doing whatever she wanted. The week in California passed quickly. Claire made sure that every moment was filled with fun and distractions. Daniel drank more than usual, and Claire was always by his side, encouraging him to leave his dark thoughts behind. "This is what you deserve," she said, smiling as the two of them walked along the beach at dusk. A light, happy life. After 7 days, they decided to return to Washington. Daniel was still shrouded in the fog of his conflicting emotions, while Claire was overjoyed at the prospect of finally taking possession of everything she wanted. A few days after their return, Daniel received a call from Robert Simmons, the lawyer for the company and Grace's family. "Daniel, we need to schedule the reading of Grace's will. It's important that you attend." Daniel paused, trying to compose his voice to sound appropriately sad. "Of course, Robert. When will it be?" "We can schedule it for 3 days from now, in my office." Daniel agreed, writing down the time. After hanging up, he turned to Claire, who was on the sofa, leafing through a decorating magazine. "The reading of the will be in 3 days," he said. Claire looked up with a triumphant smile. "Finally." Daniel looked at her hesitantly. "It's strange to talk like this, Claire. We're talking about what Grace left." Claire put the magazine aside and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around him. "Daniel, it's our life that we're building now. Grace wanted you to be well. She wanted you to have peace. That's what we're doing." Daniel shook his head, still divided, but Claire kissed him, dispelling any doubts he might have had. "Now, why don't we start thinking about what we're going to do next?" she suggested with a mischievous smile. Claire was ecstatic at the idea of finally taking on the millionaire life she so coveted. For her, it was only a matter of time before it was all hers. On the grey Washington morning, the mood reflected the tension that gripped Daniel as he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror. The day for the reading of the will had arrived, and although he wouldn't admit it out loud, he was looking forward to finally closing that chapter and moving on. Claire was standing next to him, dressed in an elegant black dress, adjusting her earrings with a smile on her face. "I want to go with you," she said casually, as she watched Daniel in the mirror. Daniel frowned. "I don't think that's a good idea, Claire. This is something I need to do on my own." Claire tried to hide her frustration, but her bright eyes betrayed her disappointment. "All right," she replied, her voice softening. "But I'll be here when you get back. We'll celebrate together." She moved closer, kissing him on the cheek and arranging his tie with exaggerated care. "All this will only be the beginning of our life together," she whispered. Daniel nodded, said nothing, and left. He didn't know why he felt so restless, but the journey to Robert Simmons' office was a long one, even if it only lasted 20 minutes. The lawyer's office was silent, with the shutters closed and a heavy atmosphere. Robert Simmons was sitting at his desk, with an expression that revealed nothing while a bulky briefcase rested in front of him. Daniel entered, clearing his throat before sitting down. "Thanks for coming, Daniel," said Robert, opening the folder. "Let's get started." Daniel leaned forward, trying to look focused, but his mind was already wandering. He imagined what he would do with the mansion, how Claire would redecorate the rooms, the trips they would take. Robert began to read. According to the will left by Mrs. Grace Morgan, all assets in her name, including the Morgan mansion, the income of the company Morgan & Co., and all associated financial assets, will go entirely to a charity dedicated to supporting people with cancer and serious illnesses, especially those who have been abandoned by their families. Daniel froze. "What?" he interrupted, his voice a mixture of incredulity and anger. "That doesn't make sense." Robert ignored the interruption and continued. "To Mr. Daniel Morgan, in recognition of his years of service to the company, will be paid an amount equivalent to the proportional value of his contributions during the period in which he was employed at Morgan & Co. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. "Are you saying that? I don't get anything. Not even the house." Robert closed the folder, taking a sealed envelope from beside it. "Grace left you a letter. Perhaps this will clarify her decisions." Trembling, Daniel took the envelope and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a sheet of paper, handwritten in Grace's familiar handwriting. He took a deep breath before starting to read. "Daniel, if you're reading this letter, Then you already know that I've left everything we've built to people who really need it. People who face the same kind of pain and abandonment that I did. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one my heart would allow. I loved you, Daniel. I loved you with everything I had. Even in the worst moments, even when I knew you no longer loved me back. I waited for you. I waited for you to look at me like you used to, but all I got was silence. When I got sick, I thought you would be my safe haven, but you left me alone. I faced chemotherapy, endless nights of pain, and the slow death of my body without you by my side. You were too busy. With Claire. Yes, Daniel, I know about her. I know everything. I know about the apartment you shared, paid for with the money from the company my parents had worked so hard to build. I know about the jewelry, the dinners, the luxurious trips you shared with her. I know that you lied to me about every business trip, including the last one to Paris. The bank statements are attached in case you've forgotten. You've already spent more than is fair, more than I could ever have left you. But the worst thing wasn't the money. The worst thing was looking in the mirror and feeling completely alone while the person I loved the most chose another life, another path, far away from me. I left this legacy to people who still have hope, who still fight, who still believe that they deserve love and dignity. And I left it to them because in the end I realized that you would never deserve what I had to give. I hope that one day you will find peace, Daniel. But today, you're going to face the truth. Grace. Daniel dropped the letter in his lap, his face pale and his eyes watery. His throat seemed closed, unable to make a sound. For a long moment, the silence was absolute, until Robert Simmons cleared his throat. As I mentioned, the documents are available should you wish to review them. Daniel shook his head, standing up suddenly. No, I have to go. He left the office with quick steps, the sound of his heavy breathing echoing through the corridors. When he finally got into his car, he sat for a few minutes trying to process what had just happened. He couldn't believe it. Grace had taken everything away from him. When Daniel arrived at the mansion, the warm light from the windows illuminated the entrance. Claire was waiting for him as promised. She had prepared an elaborate dinner, and the table was impeccably set. She herself looked stunning, in a black dress that accentuated her beauty, her loose hair falling in perfect waves. "At last!" exclaimed Claire, coming up to him with a bright smile. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming back." Daniel looked at her, but said nothing. His face was somber, his shoulders tense. Claire noticed the change immediately. "How was it?" she asked, still smiling, as she approached him to hug him. He pulled back slightly, which made her narrow her eyes. "Daniel, what happened?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but the words didn't come. He just walked into the living room and sat down on the sofa with his hands on his head. Claire, puzzled and worried, followed him. "Daniel, talk to me. What's going on?" When he finally raised his face to look at her, there was something different in his eyes, a mixture of guilt, anger, and above all, emptiness. "She left me nothing, Claire. Not the house, not the company. Everything went to charity." Claire's smile disappeared immediately. "What?" Daniel threw Grace's letter on the table in front of him. "Read it." Claire picked up the paper, and as she read Grace's words, her face changed. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Everything she had worked for, every manipulation, every lie had been in vain. Daniel remained motionless, staring into the void, unable to process the whirlwind of emotions that consumed him. Claire finished reading the letter, her hands shaking with anger. She let out a heavy sigh, almost a muffled scream, and threw the paper on the floor as if it were poisonous. Her expression of disdain was stamped on every feature of her face. She turned to Daniel, who remained seated on the sofa, his hands still clutching his head. "Don't you have anything else?" Claire asked, her voice laden with incredulity. Daniel didn't reply immediately. He was caught up in his own thoughts, the sound of Grace's words echoing in his mind. Finally, he looked up, still teary-eyed. "No, there's nothing left for me." Claire gave a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe her ears. "You've got to be kidding, Daniel. Nothing? Not even this house?" He shook his head slowly. "It was all for charity," he muttered, almost to himself. Claire crossed her arms, her expression of disbelief turning to fury. "You're an idiot, Daniel. A complete idiot." He looked at her, surprised by the tone of her voice. "What are you saying?" Claire stepped forward, pointing her finger at him. I'm saying you're a fool. How could you let this happen? How could you not realize what Grace was doing? You didn't see anything, you didn't plan anything, and now it's all gone. Claire, She interrupted him, raising her voice. You don't know how to do anything properly. I stood by you, I threw everything I had into this relationship, and you give me this? You want me to stay with you with nothing? Daniel stood up, anger finally surfacing on his face. Are you blaming me? I've lost everything. Grace took everything from me. Claire let out another cold laugh, taking a step back. And rightly so, by the way. You don't know how to play this game, Daniel. You were only useful as long as you had something to offer. The words hit Daniel like a slap. He stood still, staring at Claire, trying to process what he had just heard. You used me, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Claire didn't deny it. Instead, she walked over to a shelf in the living room and started picking up valuable objects. A gold watch, small sculptures, anything she could carry. What are you doing? Daniel asked, horrified. I'm taking what I can before I leave. Do you think I'm going to stay with you? With no home, no money, nothing, Claire replied as she picked up a bag and began to fill it. Daniel watched her in silence, his heart breaking more with every second. Everything he had sacrificed for Claire, every lie he had told, every betrayal he had committed, all to end like this, with her filling a bag with his things and leaving him without even looking back. Claire, please don't do this, he begged, but his voice was weak, almost inaudible. She paused for a moment, only to glare at him. You have nothing left for me, Daniel. It's over. With that, she turned her back and walked out the door, leaving Daniel alone in the mansion that would soon not even be his. He stood still for a few moments, as if the weight of what had just happened was too great to bear. Then slowly he let himself fall onto the sofa, holding his face with his hands as the tears began to flow. For the first time, he saw everything clearly. Grace, the woman he had betrayed and abandoned, was the only one who really loved him. She had been there for him even when he didn't deserve it, and now she was gone forever, leaving behind a void that nothing could fill. Daniel cried, sobbing loudly, while the mansion around him seemed colder and emptier than ever. He thought of every choice he had made, every lie, every moment that had put Claire above Grace, and he realized with a sharp pain in his chest that he had destroyed the only thing that really mattered in his life. Getting up with difficulty, he walked over to the mirror in the living room, the same mirror where Grace had so often looked in silence while he ignored her. He looked at himself, but he didn't see the confident man he used to be. He saw a broken, lost man, someone who had thrown away everything he had for something that was never real. Forgive me, Grace, he whispered, as the tears continued to fall. The sound of silence enveloped him, and for the first time, Daniel felt the full weight of loneliness. Claire was gone, but it was the loss of Grace that crushed him. He knew he could never undo what he had done, and that he would spend the rest of his life living with regret. Outside, the wind blew strongly, as if the world was in tune with the storm inside. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the pain in every fiber of his being, and finally surrendered to the truth that Grace had tried to show in her letter. He was alone because he chose to be, and now the echo of his decisions would be his only companion. What did you think of this story full of twists and turns and emotions? In your opinion, did Daniel deserve what happened to him? Do you think Grace did him justice, or was she too harsh? Comment below. We want to know what you think. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting content like this. And don't forget to watch the video that appears on the screen, which features another narrative full of drama and life lessons. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.